You've got to be careful, obviously, of just making comparisons that may be glib and not really stand up. But I think that in the end, John Major benefited from a very large extent to the fact that he took over from Margaret Thatcher, and therefore there was a sort of change of, almost people thought there was a change of government before the British election when Margaret Thatcher went and John Major took over. And I think in some ways the Democrats had an advantage here in that President Bush was very much saddled with the problems of the economy and so forth. And despite our best efforts, Mr. Major wasn't held responsible for those in quite the same way that President Bush was held responsible for the problems here in the United States. So, I mean, there are all sorts of differences, but I think that that was one of the key ones.
Well, I suppose, I think it's 650.
I mean, there's a 65 member of parliament difference, I think, between ourselves and the Conservatives. They got roughly, what is it, 330, and we got about 270.
That's what I wanted to ask you next. You have about 270, you say?
Well, it's done through a system of voting that involves party members. That's all the members of the party, and also members of parliament. And then there has been, although this is a subject that's being debated at the moment, there has been also some of those affiliated bodies, trade unions, cooperative societies and so forth, they've also had a vote directly in the say of the leadership. And so it's a sort of electoral college made up of those three components. And we had after Neil Kinnock indicated that he was going to stand down, we had an election that lasted, I think, about 2 or 3 months in the Labour Party, both the leadership and the deputy leadership. And Margaret Beckett, who you've interviewed, became the deputy leader, and John's been the leader. And I think it's certainly given us a great sort of sense of renewal and sense of purpose since they've taken the leadership.
Unlike in this...
Is actually televised. That's made a big difference because it's given a whole new aura to parliamentary debates. They're very much more important. They appear in our news schedules every night. And then John Smith obviously has power as the leader of the Labour Party because although the principal appointments, the people that will shadow the various government ministers, for example, Gordon shadows the Treasury Secretary and I shadow the Home Affairs Secretary, although the principal appointments are actually elected in a shadow cabinet of about 18 or 19 members, John Smith will then appoint all the other members of the front bench team, which may be another 40 or 50 or 60 people even. So it's very considerable. The leader in the House of Commons terms is not just the person that really takes the brunt of the attack and carries it to the Prime Minister, but has also got tremendous patronage within the system.
But he is also leader of the...
That's a question my wife asks me often. Because I held certain beliefs very strongly. A belief principally that Britain had to operate as a society and community if the individuals within it were to prosper and get on in life. And I wanted to try and translate those beliefs into actuality in government.
Where's home?
Home, I split between the constituency, which is in County Durham, up in the north of England, and in London. So we sort of go between the two.
How far are you from London? And you do come train or drive?
It's probably, I sometimes fly or take the train. Occasionally I drive. I mean, it will sound a very short distance in your terms, but it's actually right up in the north of England. It's about 270, 300 miles.
What were you doing before you got into politics?
I was a barrister, an advocate, and...
What's that mean in our language?
Well, it means you're a lawyer, but you're the lawyers that stand up in court for particular clients.
Went to school where?
I went to school, first of all, in Durham, which is near where my constituency is, and then I was at school in Edinburgh, and then I went on to Oxford University, and then I became a barrister and went into Parliament in 1983.
How did you get into this business?
Obviously follow them very closely because they're extremely important. I think that everybody, in principle, recognises the advantages of free trade and of an open trading market. But I think particularly at times of recession and difficulty, when there's great cutbacks and problems at home, then there's a natural tendency for countries and indeed governments to want to pull back. But I think it's very important that the process of open trade goes on, because I think it would be disastrous, particularly if the GATT talks were to fail. I think it would be absolutely disastrous for the long-term future of the world economy. And of course in Europe, we have just a few days ago, at the beginning of the year, we've opened up the single market in Europe, which means all the trade barriers, in theory at least, are supposed to come down so that we can trade freely between all the 12 member countries of the European community. And I think that there is still, I would say, a broad consensus in favour of that proposition of open and free trade.
Anything to add?
I think that you see, first of all, very strongly this idea that the problems that the country faces can only be met by a government that's prepared to be active, that sets itself key objectives that is prepared to try and fulfill. The development of employment, training and education, infrastructure, the belief that unless there's the right partnership between government and people, then the economic problems simply can't be overcome. I think that's one thing. I think secondly too, that Clinton has impressed me enormously by generating a great deal of excitement, by preparing to be open in policy making, by appearing at least to sort of break through new ground for the Democrat Party. And I think that that's a development that I mean, it's always difficult to judge from afar, but it's a development that has impressed us and that we will obviously be looking at for ourselves.
What kind of people will you meet with here? You meet with House members?
We will certainly do that, and also meet with people who have been active in the campaign. I mean, it's important, as Gordon was saying earlier, one of the reasons we're here is actually to try and look at some of the programs that are going to be developed by the administration. I mean, one of my interests is law and order and crime rate, because that's the Home Affairs brief in Britain. And you've obviously got your problems here, and we've got developing problems at home as well. And so these are the types of issues we want to discuss with them. Thing like the same extent. Although I think there's a very big worry in our country that things are going to go the same way. And you know, in a sense, what we're trying to do is to break through this idea that you either simply say, well, it's all the fault of society and what we need is more government spending, or on the other hand, people saying, well, you know, you sort of just lock them up in as large numbers as you possibly can, and people are trying to break through that and say, look, you've got to give people opportunity, but with that opportunity comes responsibility. And I think that that's a very, very important notion, because otherwise you're going to find that many of these inner city areas people just can't live in. And we can see some of these problems beginning in our country, and we want to make sure that they don't grow.
Urban crimes are huge.
Supporters of the National Health Service. And I mean, that's on practical rather than simply ideological grounds. And I think that although there's been problems with our National Health Service, and it would be wrong to pretend there weren't, the idea that my generation's grown up with in Britain, that if you're sick you will be cared for, irrespective of your wealth or your ability to pay, I mean, that is now a basic belief that underpins our society. And I don't think that any political party, at least openly, would want to challenge that. And we believe it, on the whole, it yields efficiency as well, because you're pooling resources and you don't get these big vested interests of doctors, insurance companies and so forth within the system that end up subverting it for their own purposes rather than really, you know, running healthcare in the interests of the people.
Let me say, the
full-time members of Parliament, I mean, you know, you pick up bits and pieces doing writing and so forth occasionally.
How much do you...
I mean, the big problem we have is that, you know, when we're shadowing the Treasury Secretary, the Home Affairs Secretary, we're shadowing his entire department. So, you know, you really need quite a big resource base to do that, because they've obviously got thousands of civil servants at their disposal. And that is it is a difficulty. I mean, with the constituency work, you can just about manage, but there's been a continuing problem over a long period of time for the opposition party to really make an impact when, you know, the inequality of resources between government and opposition is so vast, and that's something that we'd rather envy your congressmen and senators.
In the House of
Party?
As a party, no, there's not. You can spend as much money as you want. I think there's no.
Do you have to disclose?
We do, and it's growing. It's growing. I mean, I think it ties in with something I was saying earlier. One of the problems that we are finding in our system now is that a lot of the legislation that comes before the House of Commons is very complicated. If your members of Parliament aren't actually resourced themselves, then the risk is that the lobbyists have enormous power simply because they have the resources to give you information. And lobbying has grown in Britain over the past 10 years since we've both been members of Parliament to a very great extent. It's nothing like it is here, but you can see how it's moving in that particular direction.
What if British Telecom...
I was a member of the London Labour Party throughout the late 1970s and early 80s, and survived to tell the tale. And it's a tremendous tribute, I think, to our party that we are organising these meetings around the country where party members can come and quiz the candidates on their views. Before I begin my speech, I'd just like to say a couple of things. The first is that this is a leadership election that none of us actually wanted. Indeed, no one wanted. And the very best tribute that we can make to the memory of John Smith is in the way that we conduct this campaign over the coming few weeks. The media will no doubt try and make differences between us, and there will unquestionably be problems from time to time, as there are in any such campaign. But I think it's tremendously important that we remember that we are all members of the Labour Party, we're all part of the same political family, and what unites us is infinitely more important than anything that might divide us. And I remember just before John's death, I was through in Croydon doing some electioneering for the local government elections. Tory Croydon, for 100 years, now a Labour borough. And let's make it Labour for the next 100 years, so that we manage to bring Labour councillors all over London. And in fact, not merely did we win in Croydon, but I would like to pay tribute to the magnificent work that has been done by the London Labour Party over the past few years that has meant we've had incredible council election results here. We've had brilliant European election results, 9 out of 10 seats, now Labour, 3 parliamentary by-elections with larger majorities for the Labour Party. London has given its support to Labour, and Labour in London can now hold its head high in pride throughout the entirety of the Labour Party. And that is a very, very big tribute to the work that has been done. In the 1980s, the London effect was occasionally seen as negative. And let us put that as an understatement, various other parts of the party. In the 1990s, the London Labour Party is virtually outperforming every single part of the country. And if there was one result, one council result, that said more about the Labour Party in London and its ability and its organisation than anything else, it was the resounding victory in Tower Hamlets that brought that council back under Labour control, so that that is now Labour's proud achievement in London, driving the Liberal Democrats out, driving out the racists, and restoring that council to the Labour Party. And it is not surprising, is it, that people in London are looking to the Labour Party. We should remember the promises that were made at the last election. The promises of the Tories that they were going to introduce tax cuts year on year if they were elected. I gather now they're thinking of making Geoffrey Archer chairman of the Tory party. Very apt choice, he writes fiction. Should be very good at writing the Tory manifesto. Remember that last election, and remember the promises that they made. And tonight, if we do anything, let us speak up for those people. The hundreds of thousands that have been made unemployed in this Tory recession. The thousands of businesses that went bust, the families that were promised an economic miracle and are now struggling to make ends meet. And let us be quite clear, it is not those firms or those people or those families that have betrayed the Tory government, but the Tory government that has betrayed them, their families and their businesses and the people of London. And it is therefore vital that we remind people over these coming months and years, not just of the betrayal, but of the deception. And not just of the deception, but the incompetence and deceit with which it was put through. Because now, even now, when they're imposing value-added tax on pensioners and the poor and the most vulnerable in our society, this was not the choice that they had to make. If the Tories really want to attack the budget deficit, let them not target the poor or the pensioners or the disabled. Let them target instead the tax avoiders, the evaders, the tax speculators, the offshore companies, those in the City of London running the tax scams and the perks that we all know about. Let them target those tax abusers of the past 15 years, rather than ask average families to pay higher taxes in order to compensate for their incompetence. That pay-as-you-please system of the Tories in tax stands in sharp contrast with the Labour Party's campaign for a fairer tax system.